Welcome to Shameless Leadership. I'm your host, Sarah Dean. This show is for women leaders who are committed to advancing both their own leadership and the leadership of those around them. In each episode, I offer practical strategies and inspiring stories to help you become a more confident, compassionate, and curious leader. The truth is, you were born to lead. So let's start now, together. Hello, Shameless Leaders. Today we're going to talk about the empathy tightrope. And so the empathy tightrope is really the considerations that you make around giving too much empathy or not enough empathy. And I'm talking about this today because I work with leaders who often find themselves in one camp or the other. And so either they're so heart-centered that sometimes it gets in their way and undermines leadership, or that they're so head-centered that they're not leading with enough empathy and then they get in their way because that undermines their own leadership. So we're going to be talking about how to find that middle ground in terms of being empathetic enough that we're not considered cold and disconnected, but not so empathetic that we're always so heart-driven and emotion-driven that we potentially lose some of our effectiveness or maybe feel emotionally overwhelmed by situations. So we're going to be looking at kind of like, what's this like Goldilocks sweet spot? What's the just right zone for being empathetic and demonstrating empathy in those professional environments and in your leadership. Let's first talk about the power of empathy and why this is important. And so it's important to understand that your ability to be empathetic is going to be critical in your role as a leader. And when we talk about empathy, we're really talking about the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. So this is being able to first acknowledge and be self-aware of your own feelings. And then it's also about being able to read the feelings of others. This doesn't mean mind reading, but being able to read and understand people's perspectives and hold space for them. And sometimes if you can't tell outright what's going on with someone, being able to ask questions and hold space for other people's feelings. And that is definitely going to be a skill, but this is foundational, this ability to be empathetic and hold space for other people, for your feelings, for your self-awareness, for others as well, for other people's feelings, and your ability to self-regulate your own emotions and also help others self-regulate in different professional contexts is going to be really foundational and important for building psychological safety, building trust in your working relationships with your team members, and then building team cohesion. This is really important, especially for underrepresented communities and people who carry marginalized identities. When we have empathy and when we can hold space and really understand that my experience is different than other people's experience, and how can I put myself in their shoes, and how can I think through what does this maybe feel like for someone who has different resources or abilities or strengths or talents or access than I do, then that becomes a superpower. Our ability to hold space for other people's experiences, for other people's identities, that becomes a superpower in leadership. And when we can understand that, we can reach people and meet them where they're at. We can get buy-in from them in order to bring them with us, in order to build mutually beneficial outcomes and mutually beneficial wins. We can be more supportive, for sure, and we can create more inclusive spaces that pave the way for really, really powerful outcomes. In fact, studies show that empathetic leaders drive higher employee engagement and then reduce turnover. More empathetic leaders can attain workers for longer periods of time, and they also can create more creative and collaborative working environments. So figuring out how to navigate empathy in your role as a leader is going to be really, really important for your leadership outcomes. So we're constantly kind of having to build that bridge between the me and the we, the where am I here? What do I need? What do I want this situation to be about? And how am I thinking through how am I going to center myself? And then also thinking through how am I going to decenter myself and step into the we and recognize what does everyone else need? And how is the person who's most likely to be negatively impacted in this situation going to manage and navigate the situation? So we're really building a bridge, recognizing that we have our own needs in a situation and everyone else has their own needs in a situation. And as leaders, how are we navigating all of that? So let's look at first about the danger of having too little empathy. And this immediately makes me think of leaders who've said things to me like, well, I don't want to baby the people I'm leading, or I won't want to give them too much positive feedback. I don't want them to expect feedback as a crutch, or I don't want them to expect praise as a crutch. And when I talk to leaders who say these kinds of things, I often ask them, well, what do you think might happen if you give quote unquote too much positive feedback, or if you're too caring? And when they start to think it through, they're like, well, people will be really dependent on that. And I'm like, okay, but what's the downside of someone being dependent on your feedback? Now, I'm not saying that we're creating a culture where like we're babysitting by constantly giving them praise and like that there's a codependence in that. But I would hope that if I'm giving praise and showing people that I care and giving positive feedback, that they're excited to continue doing the great work that they're doing, and they're motivated to keep learning, and they're actually open and willing to challenge themselves because they feel safe taking chances. They feel safe challenging themselves and taking things to the next level. And this drives great outcomes for everyone. So I'm always thinking that it's like kind of like with a baby, like you can't, I'm thinking about when we talk about newborns and sleep, and it's like, well, you can't create bad habits in those first few months of having a newborn. But when you're a new parent, you're like, oh, I don't want to like, if I pick them up every time they cry, I don't want to create a bad habit. Well, for the most part, you're not going to create a bad habit by caring about people and by giving people good feedback, positive feedback, and by letting them know that you care, or by demonstrating vulnerability or holding space for them when they're feeling vulnerable. So the danger of not doing that, though, is that we end up creating situations where we don't have strong working relationships, where we haven't built trust. Because here's the thing, if you're not demonstrating empathy toward other people, they're probably not going to trust you. So your relationships will suffer. What will happen is that you will find yourself probably leading in isolation, and you might even feel left out. Like you might notice that other people within your team, they have strong relationships with one another, but you feel like you can't quite get in there. And that might be because you haven't demonstrated enough empathy to build trust to make space for yourself in those relationships. So you might end up making decisions in isolation. You might end up having to work in isolation. And you might need to think through, what's the impact of that? You might be dismissing other people's experiences or struggles. Well, if I'm being dismissive of someone's struggles, if I'm being dismissive of someone else's experiences, then are they going to trust me? Are they going to want to walk alongside me? Are they going to want to stay in this environment? You might have people who feel undervalued or not seen or not heard. And again, then how's that going to impact their work? And are they going to stick around? We know that when people don't feel valued, when they don't feel like it's safe for them to speak up, when they don't feel like it's safe to be vulnerable or to share pieces of themselves in working environments, that they then don't challenge themselves. They don't push themselves to the next level because they don't feel it's safe to make a mistake. And that basically leaves them kind of working in this space of like doing average work rather than doing excellent work, because the stakes are too high to try to do excellent work and then maybe fail at it. This also creates a culture of fear and potentially a culture of emotional detachment. This can leave people feeling unsupported and disconnected from you, from the team, from the organization, from the outcomes. And again, then what's the motivation to stick around? This impacts engagement. This impacts retainment of people. So this looks like a manager who might prioritize deadlines over burnout. This looks like a leader who maybe sticks to like the policy and the rules, I'm putting this in air quotes, instead of asking, what does someone really need right now? So if I'm a leader who leads with empathy, I would ask someone what they really need, or try to figure out what does someone really need, versus trying to do everything by the book all the time and keep everything very systematized and structured. I would be leading only from the head and not from the heart. And the cost of leading only from the head and not from the heart is all the things that we just talked about, creating this environment where people don't feel connected or engaged, and they probably don't want to stick around. So this lack of empathy can be costly over time for sure. We often see this lack of empathy coming from our own conditioning. So we don't want to be seen as soft, or we don't want to be seen as like, oh, I'm just so heart-centered and not following, strategy and data and being driven. We see this especially in high pressure and high stakes situations in male-dominated environments. We see this a lot in tech. I'm here in Seattle tech. We see this a lot in Seattle tech. In these environments where feelings are seen as a weakness. So thinking through, if you are someone who feels resistant to demonstrating empathy, if you feel like, oh, I don't want to be seen as too soft, or I don't want to like overgive the heart stuff, think about where that conditioning comes from, and then think about what that resistance is really about. It might be because you tend to be more of a thinker than a feeler, and that's okay. And so if you are familiar with Myers-Briggs, we all exist on the scale of making decisions led more by our heart or more by our head. nothing wrong with either there's nothing wrong with being more of a thinker or more of a feeler, but knowing that if I tend to be more of a thinker, then I might have a hard time demonstrating vulnerability. I might struggle with other people's vulnerability. And then what does that mean in terms of how I might undermine my own leadership at times? You might also resist demonstrating empathy because maybe you have had models of leadership where vulnerability wasn't modeled, where people didn't lead with their heart. And maybe you've had these models that are more authoritative. And so thinking through, okay, what has been modeled to me? Why am I leading the way that I am? Is it because of who I innately am? Is it because of what I've seen? Is it because I think I need to be a certain way? Is it because I have some insecurities? Is it because I'm younger or newer in leadership? So we also see this in younger and newer leaders sometimes where they think that in order to be taken seriously, like we need to be all about business and head-driven outcomes and getting things done and being highly effective, which all can be great things. And we can also make space for both sides of the coin here, being heart-driven and head-driven and using both. So really thinking through and acknowledging that empathy is not soft, it's strategic. And lack of empathy is a weakness in your leadership if you are demonstrating a lack of empathy over time, because lack of empathy ultimately fractures trust. And without trust, no one will follow you willingly, and you will consistently undermine your own credibility as a good leader. So thinking through, how do you model yourself after leaders who have the most magnetic personalities, who people can't wait to follow, who people want to be around? And not because you're trying to copy someone else's leadership and not because you're trying to be just so heart-centered and that's the opposite of who you really are, but thinking through how can you authentically, in a way that's real and true for you, find that combination to lead from the head and from the heart. Now, let's also look at the risk of too much empathy. So looking at the other side of this coin or the other side of the spectrum, what happens if we're demonstrating too much empathy? So we're just so heart-centered all the time. This would be a little bit more my struggle. Although I have to say, I can kind of go into either. I can go both ways on the spectrum. Like I have existed in both capacities. I would say in my outward leadership, though, I tend to be more the heart stuff is where I get. If I'm going to undermine my own leadership, it's probably more on the heart side. But I will say privately, I get into that opposite end, that head-driven end of the spectrum, and potentially in maybe some of my family relationships with the people that I live with, where I'm like, just do it my way. I don't care if you're having a bad day, right? Because when I get home and I'm tired, who has the time to be heart-centered, right? So thinking through also in different contexts of your lives, of your life, where this might play out differently, but thinking through, okay, if you're this heart-centered leader, where's the line between being empathetic and then being too empathetic, and consistently being too empathetic, and how is that undermining your leadership? So we know that too much empathy can hurt your leadership, because when we're only being heart-centered, sometimes we get a little stuck and we don't drive the outcomes that actually need to happen. We don't meet the deadlines that need to be met because we're making so much space for everyone's needs. Maybe because we are over processing feelings and we're getting stuck and spending too much time processing something. So this can take up too much time, first of all, but it can also lead to emotional burnout, and it can also dilute the direction that we're going. And so, or help us lose sight of the direction that we're going. So when empathy becomes over-identified or an emotional overextension, it can lead to this emotional burnout. It can lead to everyone having to be in their feelings all the time. And this is exhausting for people who are not used to this. And so if you are constantly doing feelings work in the workplace, you're going to lose people because they're like, I just want to be here and do a good job. I don't want to talk about my feelings every day. So that fine line of, I want to meet you where you're at. We need to discuss as a team, if someone's having a rough time, what do we do? But we don't need to talk about it endlessly as a team. We don't need to only be in our feelings all day, right? We also can find that over empathizing can lead to inability to set boundaries. And so if we're only looking at oh, poor so-and-so, they're in a rough spot in their life, and we are giving them too much grace then what's the cost to the rest of the team? What's the cost to the goals and the outcomes of the organization or to the work that actually needs to get done? So this idea that I don't want to hurt their feelings, or I don't want to hold them accountable. I don't want to hold them to a certain standard because of what's going on in their life or because of certain needs that they have in this moment can actually become a detriment to our own leadership, to that person, to the team, to the outcomes. This can also lead to indecisiveness. And so if we're being overly empathetic, we can be really indecisive. And this is something I've struggled with. If I'm trying to meet everyone's emotional needs and I'm trying to make sure that everyone loves the outcome and everyone's okay with everything all the time, then I can't make a decision, because part of being a leader is making a decision that sometimes is going to piss people off. No one's ever going to love every decision, or you're not ever going to be in a situation where everyone's going to love every decision. And if we're overly empathetic, we find ourselves not being able to make a decision because we're so worried that someone might be negatively impacted. And the truth is that probably every time you make a decision, someone will be negatively impacted. Then how are you as a leader who holds space for that empathy, being aware of here's who's most likely to be most negatively impacted, and here's how we can be supportive of those people, or here's how we can hold space for that. And then the other piece of too much empathy, the other outcome can be rescuing instead of leading. So you're holding so much space for other people and doing so much caretaking that you're actually not really leading. You're not keeping people accountable for moving forward and for deadlines and for productivity and effectiveness and being efficient in their work. Instead, you're taking on other people's problems and you're sitting in this emotional processing, which you maybe not be qualified to be sitting in. You're not a therapist. And so, most of you are not therapists. Maybe a few of you actually are. But for the most part, in our leadership roles, we're not therapists. Very few of us actually are. And so we're taking on other people's problems and sitting with them and processing with them instead of empowering them to go do what they need to do to solve their problems on their own with our support, to say, I see I see where you're at. I see what's happening. Go do what you need to do. I will support you. And here's the expectations that while you're doing the work that you need to do, these are the other things that need to still get done. So being aware that this can happen oftentimes, people who are socialized to be caretakers, so this happens a lot with women, can tend to be overly empathetic. People who are natural caretakers, people who are highly sensitive and really emotionally attuned to other people, or people who have been taught that being like equals and treating everyone like equals can be equals being effective. And we want to treat other people in a way where they have equal value in terms of human dignity. And if we are in a leadership position, we have to recognize that we also do have a certain level of authority to get things done and to be holding people accountable in certain ways. And if we're not doing that, we're undermining our own credibility, our own authority, and our own leadership. So we don't want to be over functioning in our empathy, so that we're so overly attuned to other people's emotions that we abandon our own need, or abandon the vision of the team or the mission, or that we don't really push ourselves in terms of growing to a new leadership edge. So how do we find that sweet spot? We want to find that empathy sweet spot and be able to be empathetic, to model vulnerability, to hold space for vulnerability without burning out, without overfunctioning, without losing your connection to other people, without losing your sense of direction, without being able to hold space for this both and of we need to be really highly effective and productive people in the workplace, and we need to be human beings who hold space for human beings who are all living very human experiences in and out of the workplace. So the first thing you can do is differentiate between empathy and emotional absorption, recognizing that empathy means that you are understanding someone's situation, but you're not carrying that for them, and nor are you letting them off the hook for the things that need to get done. You might make concessions and you might make adjustments in order to help them through a given moment, but you're not taking on their stuff, and you're also not letting them off the hook in terms of now you don't expect anything from them and everyone else has to pick up the pieces, or you have to pick up the pieces for them. You're also making sure that you are setting boundaries with compassion. So you're not saying hey, I don't care that you're having a bad day, this needs to get done. It's hey, I hear that you're having a bad day and I am really sorry, and please let us know how we can support you. let us know if you need something special today, or maybe like you can't get this thing done by 4 today, but maybe you can get it done by noon tomorrow. And that works in this instance. Maybe that doesn't always work, but how can we set boundaries with compassion? So empathy doesn't mean that you bend over every time. It doesn't mean that you're always flexible. It doesn't mean that you say yes to every person's need, but it does mean that you acknowledge where folks are at, that you can be kind, but you're also firm and clear, because clear is kind, as Brene Brown talks about. So you're firm and you're clear, and you let people know what the expectations are. You can say, I understand this is really difficult, and here's what I need right now to support the bigger vision or the bigger picture of the team. Next is checking in with your values. And so checking in with your values and being anchored in your leadership decisions, but thinking through, what does integrity look like? So hopefully integrity looks like a combination of leading from the head and the heart. And while one more may come more naturally to you, understanding the value as part of your leadership, the value of both as part of your leadership values. So the value of leading with the head and the heart as a combination versus one or just the other means that you are acting in integrity, that I'm showing up and I'm recognizing that here's how I can lead with the head and the heart. Here's how I can hold space for what needs to get done and what a human being might need in this moment, so that we're acknowledging the both and here. Sometimes this does mean making decisions that disappoint others. Sometimes this does mean having to hold people accountable in a certain way. You can still do this in a way that's in integrity, right? So it means that you're balancing that compassion with courage. This means practicing emotional regulation. And so practicing your own emotional regulation, that you're not getting overly sucked into other people's emotions, and that you're also not like have such an emotional wall up or have so much armor up that you are not connected to emotion. So emotional regulation means that I'm not going to get overly sucked into someone else's big emotions. And I'm also not going to keep up such a wall that that I'm completely out of touch emotionally. So being sure that that I am managing my emotions in a way that allow me to have an emotional experience in front of other people that is an appropriate emotional response to meet a moment in a way that upholds the dignity of the people in front of me. So it doesn't mean I'm ignoring them if they're having an emotional experience and like shutting down and not able to be in connection with them. And it doesn't mean that I'm overly emoting with them and letting us get so sucked into the emotions that we can't move forward from the situation. And then lastly, it looks like leading with empathy and action. So it's holding space for the feelings and for what needs to get done. When we can do this, this is where we get to build trust. This is where we get to show people that we care for them and that we also understand what our role is here. And here's how we're going to show up consistently: by demonstrating care, by demonstrating kindness, by demonstrating respect and integrity, and by making sure that we go where we need to go as a team, as an organization, as humans within this shared experience that we're in. And that's where leadership really gets to grow. So again, recognizing that empathy is not soft, it's strategic. It's not about absorbing other people's pain. And it's also not about putting up a wall when other people demonstrate feelings or emotion in front of you. It's about acknowledging what's happening, honoring what's happening, and still showing up with strength and a sense of direction. It's also about not feeling like you need to make everyone happy. It's about being okay with not everyone being happy with you. It's about guiding people toward a shared vision or shared goals while honoring their humanity and upholding their human dignity and your humanity and your human dignity. So striking that balance so that you can become the kind of leader that people trust and follow and hopefully then emulate, right? So that's like the other piece of this, is thinking through, how am I leading in a way that the people that I'm leading will emulate my leadership behavior? Because remember, this is all part of building your leadership brand. This is all part of your leadership legacy. So how are you challenging yourself to find that middle ground where you're not overly empathizing and you're not totally disconnected from empathy and feelings, but you're finding that middle ground sometimes in ways that are uncomfortable, that challenge you to grow in order to develop that leadership brand in a really intentional way, in order to develop your leadership legacy in a really intentional way. So I hope this was helpful. I hope that you have some ideas now in terms of how can I balance out or find my spot on this tightrope, which is in that sweet spot of not overly empathizing, not under empathizing, but understanding that balance between holding space for what needs to get done and holding space for the human condition in any space where things need to get done. Share this episode out with others in your network and your team so that we can all be on the same page when it comes to empathy, so that we can really understand. I mean, I think when it comes to emotional intelligence, there's just so much value in having shared language and understanding where we're all trying to come from, even if we're very imperfect as we're practicing it. So share this out with your team, share this with other leaders in your network. Thank you for allowing me to spend time in your ear today. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe to this channel. To learn more about my speaking, training, and coaching services, visit sarahdean.com. That's SARADEAN. I would also love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn at sarahdean.com/LinkedIn or on Instagram at sarahdeanspeaks. I love hearing from my listeners. Thank you for showing up for yourself today. I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding space for you today and every single day.